Well, good afternoon. Yeah. I told you yesterday that we'll be going Hollywood today, right? Oh, Calvin is here. Okay. Full house. How are you? Good? Terrific?
It was raining, but now it's not.
Yeah. AP, well, 2 weeks left.
16 days.
16 days. Okay. Okay, so today will be our last conversation on the civil rights per se. Of course, we're moving to the class aspect of the whole civil rights revolution, right? We started with Brown v. Board of Education, and then the pushback from the Southern Manifesto, right? You've read MLK's letter from the Birmingham jail. You read Carmichael's Black Power. We watched documentary, The Time Has Come, the PBS documentary yesterday. Okay? And you've written some reflections on the ballot versus the bullet, Malcolm X's take. Today we're going to take a look at the two civil rights leaders in a kind of a comparative way. You read Cone, demystifying Martin and Malcolm. Okay? So we can draw on the previous knowledge, what we've been discussing all week. Okay? Take 2 minutes. Talk to the person next to you. Why does Cone insist that we demystify Martin and Malcolm? 2 minutes.
Well, I feel that Cohen's sort of idea is that both Martin and Malcolm
Like make it more clear like what they were standing for, like take away like the mystic aspect.
using the system to better making this
What I like really interpreted about this was kind of like how some people today seem to like think of Martin Luther King as like a civil rights leader that has been like almost like appropriated or like kind of like cleansed, like to be like more like non-violent and like killer versus like Malcolm X, who was like this like radical violent leader. And how like neither one of them really what they are different human beings. So like this question is not like Martin Luther King versus Malcolm X, it's more like they were
Especially since the documentary touched on how they used. I really like how they differentiated between Martin was a political revolutionary, whereas Malcolm was a cultural revolutionary. One point one. It was like, yeah, like you talked about different sides of the same coin. It was like they're using him to counter, and just like, but also like the other interesting part was like how Martin Luther King was like the civil rights, like the Birmingham letter, how like he was the one. Martin like was like most whites are not prepared to listen to the hard truth of Malcolm X. They like Martin King because as one white university said, he went about everything in the right way, which really means white people's way. Malcolm chose a more destructive way, which really means a way contrary to
page 119, on the bottom of the left down to the top of the right.
and it's very
There's this kind of like notion about how Martin Luther King went from like his nonviolent I Have a Dream speech to like this more radical person, and like there's this line at the top of page 119 that says he realized, talking about Martin Luther King, as Malcolm did before him, that tokenism seemed to be the only kind of integration that white people would have.
Okay. All right, a lot of energy here. Okay, so again, the question is, why does James Cone insist that we demystify Martin and Malcolm? What does he mean by demystifying these two leaders? And why?
What he really means by demystifying is kind of like by putting them in their context. And by putting them in the context, he means by putting them in the context of the 1960s, where there was a quote about it, but also putting in the context of each other. So one is nothing without the other, kind of the contrasting, looking at I Have a Dream by Martin Luther King, but also looking at Malcolm X's reply and seeing how they kind of both are two kind of dancing dynamics of black nationalism and, integration versus black power and such and the lot. It's kind of, if you don't look at both sides, you may be unproductive, you may not be able to achieve the goals you want because you're kind of dismissing an entire aspect, kind of tools that you could utilize to continue the civil rights movement. And so it's necessary to put them into their context. And so you can't just deify Martin Luther King because he had his own vices, but also his tools, his approach won't always work. And same thing for Malcolm. Like, you can't just completely bash him because he said some good things about that stuff. And so putting them in their context is the important point.
Robert and I talked about something similar, in which, especially in regard to the press at the time, then you see that when Malcolm X died, there was almost no coverage for him, and that when there was, even the black newspapers at the time said that we're glad that he's essentially gone because he put a bad name on this movement. And so, like Andrew was saying, we're saying that without Malcolm X, then Martin Luther King doesn't really have like Malcolm X essentially for the devil's advocate for Martin Luther King's movement. But there's like the contrast you can see between.
Yeah, and I think that like you can see that kind of like the difference in how they're portrayed, and like kind of the reason behind that is a lot of kind of how white people saw Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. So like on page 241, or no, page 119 on the right side.
Let's use the course reader page. Okay.
And then on the right side, it talks about the radical side of Martin Luther King, right? But then he says that the reason why the Martin Luther King holiday is portrayed as kind of like how it is portrayed now is like it's talking about how when President Reagan and Congress established the King holiday, they didn't vote for his anti-Vietnam speech.
Which paragraph?
It's the middle paragraph.
Okay.
They didn't vote for his anti-Vietnam speech or his challenge to Lyndon Johnson about ending poverty. And then later on, civil rights leaders have done far too little to correct the distorted image that whites created for Martin. I think that it seems to the cone that the image that we see or that we know of Martin was a created image. Yeah.
It's also kind of going off of that on page 121 on the right side, like the third paragraph down. There's this line, and it says, most whites are not prepared to listen to the harsh truths of Malcolm X. They like Martin King because, as one white university student said, he went about everything in the right way, which really means white people's way. Malcolm chose a more destructive way, which really means a way contrary to the desires of whites. And then it talks about how like Martin Luther King and his like peaceful message that was more like appealing towards white people, like helps white people give him his support. But then later on it talks about how it was like Malcolm X's kind of like message of unifying like the black community in America was like equally as important as Martin Luther King's like push for integration, and like only the two combined could really bring like freedom.
So do you guys agree with Cone that you need both? That you need to have both of them for a complete identity?
What about you? Do you agree, or you know? Yes, tell them what your position. Then maybe they can respond to you. What do you think?
I do agree with Cone. I think he made some really compelling arguments about having them individually, because without Martin, or in contrast to Martin, Malcolm seems too violent. But then when you look at Martin's radical side, then you get the full picture. But you need to look at everything as a whole picture rather than just focusing on one person.
Just gonna add on to this question. So what was Cone kind of advocating where Malcolm X's approach could be useful in modern day politics? I was confused about like that kind of.
On page 121, towards the bottom, at the very end, or not the very end, but it says Malcolm, not Martin, is the best source for understanding racism and its consequences in America. So because he was like had such like I guess radical views and went to the extreme. You saw like how consequential the effects on racism had on Black people. It was extreme, which is Malcolm.
Let's stay with Andrew's question a little bit. Okay, you want to repeat the question in case anybody missed it?
Where was he advocating applying Malcolm's approach into modern day politics, or like where Malcolm's mindset could help with current Black issues?
Well, on 121 on the left side, it talks about Malcolm as a cultural revolutionary. He says he changed the way Black people think about themselves. He revolutionized the Black mind, and then it goes down, goes on to say he transformed from a Negro to an African American, and he taught Blacks that they should be proud of their African origin. So a lot of Malcolm's message was about self-empowerment. And I think Cohn's main argument is talking about identity, and in order to have a complete identity, you need to have both Martin and Malcolm, and this is the part of the identity that Malcolm provides.
I think Martin Luther King was preaching more of like civil rights, trying to like include Black people into the table, like we were talking about yesterday, where Malcolm was really trying to build his own table and like trying, like as you said, like empowering Black people. And I guess he was also very like knowledge, and like he like went to different countries, like went to Africa and like Mecca, and I guess like he was kind of bringing this like African nationalism, I guess, to the table, and like this like Black nationalism was like kind of was revolutionary in itself, because it's like really he's trying to create his own community and separate from trying to integrate areas, but like trying to create another place where they're finally accepted, and that's like also by like encouraging Black people to like try their best and like trying to be like their support.
But by the way, Martin Luther King went to Africa. He was present in 1957 when Ghana, the first Black nation to become independent. He was there before even Malcolm X got there. Just a factual lesson. Okay.
I think going back to Andrew's question about what Cohn was, like what Cohn's position was, I think we need to look at page 118, right hand, and it's like the second main paragraph. He says, "What are we to make of this reversal of places between Malcolm and Martin? Is it a good or bad thing for the pendulum to swing toward Malcolm and away from Martin? Anyone who has read my book Martin and Malcolm in America, A Dream or a Nightmare, or has heard me talk about Martin and Malcolm, knows that nothing could please me more than the resurgence of interest in Malcolm X, uncritical adoration of Martin by both Blacks and whites, and knee-jerk disparagement of Malcolm have created the false impression that Martin had all the answers and Malcolm had nothing to contribute, or worse, was a hindrance in the Black freedom struggle." So I think that really what Cohn is trying to make clear is that they balance each other. One was not better than the other. They were equally as important, but that he talks about this adoration of Martin and this disparagement of Malcolm, and then that needs to balance out because they were both important.
What Andrew asked before is that what's Cohn's argument regarding modern day America and how we can apply these points? And so I think for that you have to look at course reader page 122, the final paragraph of the piece. Yes, so he says, "Let us therefore create in America, not just for Martin and Malcolm, or for whites and blacks, but for Latinos, Indians, and Asians, and for women in all groups, for gay men and lesbians, for every people, every culture, and every faith in this land." And so it's a good argument to make, and he's like essentially wrapping it all together, but I also found it was like kind of vague, and it wasn't necessarily regarding like what Martin or Malcolm X were saying. And I think it's an argument that's made by a lot of people, and he doesn't necessarily say how we can achieve it by using Malcolm's and Martin's piece of advice.
Well, if you look on page 121 on the right hand side, it says, I thought it said we must start with Malcolm. Do you guys know what that is?
Oh yeah, it's really right at the bottom of 121.
Will you read it?
Oh yeah, it says, Well, like, I think to give more, okay, so it says blacks must begin with Malcolm, that is, with a healthy regard for themselves, their history and culture as it stretches back to the continent of Africa, but we must not stop with Malcolm. To do so would stunt our growth and thus hinder the realization of our human potential. And he's saying that specifically in response to what he said on the last full paragraph on the right side of 121, when he's talking about how Malcolm X, like, kind of fought for black power and like a strong black community, but how Martin Luther King, I guess, took a more like intersectional approach to his like civil rights. He has this quote: "All life is interrelated. All are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." So like to fight for like true freedom from discrimination, like you also need Martin Luther King and his like argument that all like types of discrimination are interrelated.
And I think if we look, the first part that you read from blacks must begin with Malcolm, the next part of that I think is also like important. He says we must embrace Martin too as passionately and lovingly as we embrace Malcolm. I know that such a demand will be difficult for many lovers of blackness, but Martin's vision of black people living together with all human beings as brothers and sisters is as important as Malcolm's vision of blacks living together as one. The human family is as important as the black family because we either learn to live together with others or we will perish together. We must choose life and not death. So I think, yeah.
Okay, so far the last 3-4 voices, we've shot ourselves to the very end of the test, right? And I'm wondering if earlier on somebody mentioned the reversal of places. Can we go back and look at the historiography? What is he talking about? Reversal of places. Remember what Andrew said, context is everything, right? What does he mean by reversal of places? You know, here we're looking at timeline, the historiography. Take a moment, 30 seconds or so, to look at.
I think, like, I guess one big thing that Cohen saw as a reversal of places was kind of how people at the time viewed Malcolm and MLK. I guess
At what time? Let's be a little specific, yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
What is that?
Dr. Queen.
Okay.
What I was thinking of is like, and then he talks about how like the effectiveness of their methods to combating racism, and so it talks about how like with college students in like at the time, so that was like 1990s, about how like young generations believe that Malcolm X and his methods were more effective in combating the issues that they experienced. So he talks about like many young blacks are acting as if they do not need Martin King, and then that he like contrasts that with they're committing the same mistake that their elders made when they ignored Malcolm and exclusively embraced Martin. And so I think that like that reversal of places that Cohen is talking about is about like how people perceive their methods to like combat racism.
I think also like it has to do with the polls that he has on the left side of 118. Malcolm X evokes much more respect today among blacks than he did during his lifetime. In a 1946 New York Times poll, only
1964.
Did I not say that? Okay,
Go
sorry.
ahead.
64 New York Times poll, only 6% named Malcolm as doing the best work for Negroes. Yesterday's Negroes are black today. This transformation is reflected in their enhanced appreciation of Malcolm. According to a November 1992 Newsweek poll, 57% of all blacks regard Malcolm as a hero. So, and then on the other side says interest in Martin King is declining. So we have this resurgence, well, not even a surgence, because it never happened before, of interest in what Malcolm X ideals were, and like a decrease in Martin King. I think that's what that reversal of roles was.
You can see, like, he makes a kind of clear argument about why he thinks that happened, right underneath a new look at Malcolm. The first sentence, 8 years of Ronald Reagan's savage attacks upon the black poor shocked the African American.
Page.
Sorry, one sentence, my fault.
Right, Yeah.
Right underneath the New Look about. 8 years of Ronald Reagan's savage attack upon the black poor shocked the African American community into taking another look at Malcolm X. And then he kind of gave examples of how they kind of started looking at Malcolm X again. And then he, on 118 in that middle paragraph, he described Malcolm as he's an inner city cultural icon who often receives as much devotion from the hip hop generation as Christians give to Jesus. St. Malcolm is what they sometimes call him. So I think what he's kind of getting at is they've seen how Martin Luther King, they feel like Martin Luther King was successful in getting what he wanted. He got this kind of got a civil rights movement all going, and they've seen how this has worked out, and they saw the resurgence of kind of conservatism and Ronald Reagan come up, and they had a feeling almost like America's rejected us again, or this did not work, and so now, and look at King. King is kind of as Cohn kind of talked about what the white man wants. Let's have a black idol. Let's have a black what's the word? Personal role model. Yeah, something that's somebody who's promoting being proud to be black, and someone who came from the inner city who are just like that, and who understands the true suffering of racism in America.
Now, we've not discussed Reagan yet. Maybe next week we'll go there. But I suppose anybody has any idea who he was and who? Calvin? Oh, okay. Yes. It says, wait, it says 8 years of Ronald Reagan's savage attack upon the black poor. Yes.
Wouldn't that be the war on drugs, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, let's hear Calvin. He's waiting to have his voice heard. Come on, guys, give him a break.
Anyway, Ronald Reagan was our beloved, or I don't know, he's not beloved by everyone. He was our president from, I think, 81 to 89, the model of modern conservatives. He initiated the war on drugs that sent many African Americans to jail, and he cut back on many welfare programs.
Social programs.
Yeah.
Welfare has such a negative connotation. Let's say social programs.
He cut back on many social programs that negatively harmed many African Americans, and he initiated the war on drugs, which also had a huge impact on the African Americans.
Any other war he initiated besides the domestic war on drugs and social programs? Foreign policy. Anybody has any idea?
Cold War. It was after.
This is Vietnam.
He's very active with the Soviet Union.
It was also right.
Cold War. Okay, we'll get
And
there.
it was also right after the Iranian hostage crisis.
We'll get there. But foreign policy, it was on his watch. Mm-hmm. That's not to say he caused it, but his policies had a role to play. The crumbling of the Soviet Union as we knew it. Okay, George Bush was the one in power when finally the Berlin Wall came down. Anyway, so you get a context of what are the reversal of role. Miranda, do you have? I thought you were going to say something or something. Yeah. Okay.
So Calvin brought up Ronald Reagan being conservative. That just kind of reminded me of page 120 on the left side, where it talks about Malcolm X as a black conservative. And so I was wondering what that view on him, how that played into his popularity amongst the youth.
Let's open up the conversation. Okay, get other voices. Why was he known in certain circles as the black conservative, Malcolm X, the so-called radical gun-toting, by any means, and yet he was some characterized him as a black conservative?
Well, it says the reasons that people believe he would be a black conservative is that this man named Tony Brown says, I think Malcolm X was essentially, left of 120, the top paragraph. I think Malcolm X was essentially a black Republican by today's standards. Brown says, I used two basic criteria to come to this conclusion. Number one, Malcolm was for individual opportunity. Number two, he was for self-help. This is Republican philosophy.
And in addition, I feel like we see this idea that Malcolm X is more so geared towards helping, like you said, Abby, more towards this idea of self-help and individuality in the Black community. While Martin Luther King advocates these broader social programs that impact white people, like for instance, at the top of the left of 121, in the first full paragraph, it says, when Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas and other Black conservatives can claim allegiance to Malcolm, and President Reagan and other white conservatives can claim Martin, then we know that a lot of intellectual working students as to the community of Martin and Malcolm are not co-opted by their enemies. Martin was a political revolutionary. He transformed this political and social life of Black and white Americans. I feel like that's a big key difference here.
I think one thing that I thought was really significant on the left side of 120, talking about Malcolm X and in general like Black conservatives, there's this line at the first sentence of the last paragraph on the left side of 120. Black conservatives want African Americans to choose between affirmative action programs, which they reject, and self-help programs, which they embrace as if the two are contradictory. This is a false choice, and no groups in America are expected to make that choice except Blacks and other people of color. Whites do not have to make that choice, especially the men of their group. No group has had more affirmative action programs than they, more than 200 years of them. So it's kind of like Cone is talking about how Malcolm X was kind of against like programs like that would have been similar to affirmative action programs that kind of were like the government trying to like raise up this one group, and instead he would want to help themselves. But how like those programs, I guess, like are only like giving like equality, I guess, to those groups instead of, because white people have, and like white men in particular, Cone is saying, have had these programs, if not like written down, but subconsciously like this entire history of the nation, I guess.
Did he say that Malcolm X believed that, or that Black conservatives were kind of painting that image of Malcolm?
Well, it says that Black conservatives are against these programs, and then he said that Black, like everyone interprets Malcolm X to be a Black conservative.
And yet the misinterpretation of
Speak to the class, yeah.
okay, so I was just gonna talk about like how Malcolm X is like misinterpreted in a lot of different ways, especially like he didn't advocate for violence. He said that if violence is put on our community, we'll fight back. And I think that the media has like painted him as like this very violent leader, and that's like kind of counter the Black American movement, just saying like, okay, you have this peaceful leader like Martin Luther King, and you have this like outrageous leader like Malcolm X. And it talks more about this on 120 on the right side. And the second to last paragraph, where it says like, when Malcolm X says like any means necessary, that doesn't necessarily mean like picking up a gun. It could mean like, it says like his daughter said it can involve reading books and studying hard. And so like again he brings up like this cultural revolution of like bringing up this like Black community, and media is kind of painting him in a different light, especially like what you were talking about with Black conservatives, how they thought of him in a different way than he actually was.
Let's make sure we all do understand those terms that Cone is using. Martin was a political revolutionary, and Malcolm a cultural revolutionary. Okay. Let's hear as many different voices as we can. What does that mean? What's your understanding of that?
And the definitions that they give for the difference between political and cultural revolutionaries is that cultural regards to the way that people like thought about themselves, and then how people thought about the people around them, mostly referring to the Black community these days. And then for King, then he was essentially preaching to both cultures, and that because he was preaching to white and Blacks, then he could essentially change like the entire scope of America and how they view themselves politically, instead of just one demographic.
And to put it into like historical context, was like W.E.B. Du Bois he was more of the political revolutionary because he was preaching to both groups, and he was trying to like make a deal and like trying to like appease them, not like appease them to get what they want. Essentially, where Malcolm X or Booker T. Washington, I guess they're comparable, wanted full rights and wanted like absolute like, yeah.
I don't understand.
Yes, let's hear Miranda.
Well,
Yes.
I really understand how that makes him like a political revolutionary versus a cultural revolutionary, like addressing both groups. Like what, I guess necessarily why is that? Why do they have two different titles?
Well, I think that I feel like Martin was a political revolutionary because he worked for he worked towards bettering the government and the justice system, like improving the laws, enforcing the laws, giving African Americans equal rights through the laws and making sure that was enforced. Whereas, which you had to work with the white community to do that. Whereas Malcolm was about bettering his own community, which was like and revolutionizing the culture of blacks, empowering the community, and so that that was why Malcolm was cultural, whereas Martin was political.
Yeah, and
Okay. Yes. Yeah. Go for it. Mhm.
I mean, I feel that I mean, when he says that Martin was a political revolutionary, it's like, you know, Martin was trying to revolutionize the politics, right? As Abby was saying, you know, he was trying to, you know, vote and protest and work within the confines that he had, right? You know, that, you know, we have a white government, you know, work within that. Whereas Malcolm rather, he was more trying to completely turn it on its head, right? Like create a new culture kind of within America of black nationalism and black power and that kind of stuff. So I think that's sort of, as you were saying, Abby, that kind of goes hand in hand with that.
I think my question was though, like, why are they exclusive? Like, why can we not call Malcolm like a political revolution? Like, I guess in that, not really in that sense, but they're all kind of like trying to aim for the same goal, I guess, and they all have the same goal, but in different ways. So I was just wondering, like, is it mutually exclusive? Like, are the titles mutually exclusive?
Yes, there's a question on the table. Is the political revolution mutually exclusive to cultural revolution? Yes.
I think Cohen kind of makes this distinction about who's it's impacted. Who it's impacted. There it is. Who it's
Take your time. Take your time.
So political revolutionary, like he's talking about how Martin was kind of helping black college students and people in black middle class and above, helping them take advantage of opportunities and get to the same level, you know, get to the same of opportunities and economic level as whites around it. While Malcolm was focusing, or not necessarily focusing, but kind of galvanizing people in the streets, galvanizing people who, the half of the black babies who are born into poverty, that percentage of trying to get the lower classes to come up. I mean, he talks about in Cohen talks about on the first page, on the right side, on 17. But despite the progress in middle-class black America, the black underclass are poorer today than they were in the 1960s. 1/2 of black babies are born in poverty, and nearly 25% of black men between the ages of 19 and 28 are in jails, prisons, or await their day in court. With no respect for themselves or anybody else, black youth are dropping out of school, having babies, joining gangs, selling drugs, and killing each other with a frequency that boggles the imagination. And I think it's that with no respect for themselves or others. That's what Malcolm X is trying to change. So Malcolm X is making you try to realize the importance of seeing your roots, making black youth trying to realize the importance of reading books, and just how important reading books can be to taking up arms against racism. And so like that's where I thought the cultural revolution came, and the distinction, and maybe why they can be mutually exclusive is kind of political. It helps people who can't take advantage of those opportunities, while cultural helps the entire culture rise up to be able to take advantage.
If we could use some mathematical or symbols, or not mathematical, just visuals, which one would be a subset of the other? We have the politics and we have the culture. Could politics be a subset of the culture, or vice versa, the culture being a subset of the politics? Think about it for a second.
I think that the culture is a subset of the politics, and that one of the factors that might have made Martin Luther King in his time much more, I guess, well liked in the wider the wider America, is that Martin kind of provided a culture for Malcolm's ideals to actually manifest, because without the political advancement, then you can't really have the cultural growth.
I kind of thought it might be like the other way around, because I thought that if you're inciting a culture in which social rights in this case is such a big deal, then we saw with Martin Luther King, where essentially he was moving an entire culture, and without that cultural movement, I think the government would not have changed they wouldn't have changed anything. So also the standpoint of African Americans in the United States. So I think before you can have political change, you need cultural change.
But
Let's hear.
I was gonna say, I don't think that Martin Luther King was necessarily creating a cultural change in the way that Malcolm X was, though, because Cone kind of says on the left side of 121, talking about Malcolm as a cultural revolutionary, talking about how he revolutionized the black mind, and kind of created this empowerment and changed the definition of what it meant to be black, versus Martin Luther King. I think he really pandered towards the political side of it. He wanted political change, and I don't think that he changed any culture in the way that Malcolm X did, because I don't think that Martin Luther King made people view themselves in a different way, or view their community in a different way. And I think that that was why, that's the crux of Cone's argument, is that you need both, because you need the I agree, I think you need the cultural change and the political change, but I don't think that Martin Luther King was creating both of them, I guess.
I think if you look at it completely separate from this issue, just at society in general, I think you'll find that the culture and politics are interdependent on each other. The politics impacts the culture, whereas at the same time as the culture impacts the politics. It goes hand in hand, and it's a cycle. And it kind of goes with the current atmosphere of society. So you'll have, during say one presidency, you'll have a certain group who advocates one way because that's the feeling of society now, and then it will change, and then culture will change, and the politics will change, or then the politics, there's a new law or something that affects your culture. I really think they're interdependent, and it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with civil rights, or it's just a fact of.
What is culture? What's your understanding of that concept, culture? Just basic. Listen, when you hear the word culture, what exactly?
Kind of values or trends held by the society.
Okay.
I think of communities and the traditions they have within them, and usually the communities are like-minded people, and they have different things that they celebrate together, different things that they value.
Any other thing? A total way of life. It's a way of life that would include politics. What else? Economics. Religion. It's a language. So it's a totality. So Miranda, in that sense, I think we could say that politics would be a subset of culture. But of course, politics does inform culture in the long run. Okay. We have about 10 minutes, but now I want us to go towards the end, 121, right? Okay. The last, blacks must, can someone who hasn't read that for us? Someone? Yeah.
Blacks must begin with Malcolm, that is, with a healthy regard for themselves, their history and culture as it stretches back to the continent of Africa. But we must not stop with Malcolm. To do so would stunt our growth and thus hinder the realization of our human potential. We must embrace Martin too, as passionately and as lovingly as we embrace Malcolm.
Okay. Blacks must begin with Malcolm. Why should blacks begin with Malcolm and not Martin?
Well, I mean,
Yes, yes.
well, I mean, kind of going back to what we were just talking about, about what informs what. I mean, if we're kind of going with the idea that the culture informs the politics of a nation, the culture of a group informs the politics of that group. I mean, we're told that Malcolm's the sort of cultural revolutionary, and that in saying that blacks must begin with Malcolm, it's saying exactly, we must begin with the cultural shift before we can sort of reach the political shift.
I think it's also saying that in hand with that you need blacks need to help them it was help themselves and realize who they are and empower them and create that strength before thinking about what Martin's looking for.
Yeah.
I think it's like having where they talked, I think, about self-worth and such.
Yes, Geneva.
Yeah, there's another key part on page 121 of the right-hand side above from where we started from. It says, how can we overcome racism if we do not admit how deeply this cancer is embedded in American history and culture? Malcolm, not Martin, is the best source for understanding racism and its consequences in America. And so I think that's why Cone is saying, along with what Abby was saying, to start with Malcolm, because Malcolm realized how deeply racism was embedded in the culture. And even if you look at page 119, when it talks about the radical Martin, Martin acknowledged, it says on the left hand on the bottom, it says the radical Martin acknowledged that racism was much more deeply embedded in American life than he had initially realized. So it was Malcolm who had this realization, that's why you have to start there.
I think it also, when I was reading that, I was thinking about the SNCC position paper, particularly on page 115.
The Black Power
The Black
piece,
Power,
yeah. 115.
Yeah. In the middle paragraph on the left, there's this line: whites can only subvert our true search and struggles for self-determination, self-identification, and liberation in this country. Reevaluation of the white and black roles must now take place so that whites no longer designate roles that black people play, but rather black people define white people's roles. So kind of how by allowing white people to kind of dictate, I guess, and really inform the movement, it's not going to work in gaining the power that the black people are aiming to get from this movement. So you need to start with the power that Malcolm X, I guess, kind of is trying to spread before you can go to Martin Luther King and his message of equality and integration.
And I think I agree with you, and I think Malcolm's approach to building up the black community, creating a strong foundation, can build up leaders that can help lead the revolution. And I feel like Martin Luther King is depending a lot on the white community to try to help them create legislation change when you need to focus on the groundwork. And Malcolm says this in his Bullet versus
The ballot versus bullet.
How there's a lot of different problems in the black community and how we need to eradicate that to help move on instead of going straight to we need your help, we need your help, we need your help.
Okay, so to use the table metaphor, I think it was Lizzie at the very beginning of the conversation said Martin wanted people to be admitted to the table, the American table, right? Malcolm said that was a wrong decision. Malcolm would set up his table for self-identification. You see the Black Power thing that Isadora just read. Self-identity. But Kohn says we must not stop there. In other words, once you set up your table, now we can reach in on equal terms, everybody proud. Question. Oh, put them together, right? Okay, so Exeter. No, I've been here 12 years. Every year we celebrate Martin Luther King's Day. Not a word, except 1 year there was a professor from Brown, years ago, before you guys came, who gave some workshop on, even it was within the context of the radical Martin that he mentioned, Malcolm X. Should Exeter embrace Malcolm X in our celebration of Martin Luther King?
I thought there was a workshop on that.
There was one this year.
Oh, I wasn't here. I was on sabbatical. Who attended the workshop? Anybody? Yes. What transpired? Can you give a little?
I mean, my memory doesn't serve me very well right now, but I mean, I think it was basically sort of similar to what was going on in the Demystifying Martin and Malcolm. It was kind of sort of comparative sort of thing, and kind of, you know, explaining how Malcolm sort of, as we saw here, it was more about the kind of cultural thing about the black nationalism, about, you know, create your own table, and how Martin, as we've discussed earlier, also kind of, or has the different idea rather that, you know, try and find your place in the table, and it was just basically, it kind of revolved around that same topic.
Okay. Anybody for the last word? Question? Anything that we didn't really touch upon? We have just about 2 minutes. Any question? Yeah.
I can't help but think that religion had some sort of play with how Malcolm and Martin are portrayed in the media, just because Malcolm was a Muslim and Martin Luther King was a devout Christian, and I feel like most people in America were Christians, so, and related to that like kind of cause. So I just think that religion had some sort of play with it, how they were liked by the general public.
I had a question that kind of answers, like, why did the older generation of like African Americans in America kind of embrace MLK more than Malcolm X, and to be part of that?
Well, say that again.
I was just like, a question I had was kind of why did older generations of African Americans embrace MLK over Malcolm X, and then kind of like now why did I said it, so.
And the answer?
We were talking about the religious aspect.
Okay.
That's all I was
Okay.
saying.
Yeah. Okay.
But,
Go ahead.
but what about the youth? Because we know that from the SNCC reading we read last class, they were also more closely aligned with Malcolm. So what about the youth, or what about Malcolm attracts the youth over Martin?
I mean, like you see in most movements, like the youth are oftentimes the one that are proponent for the most change. And so I think in this case, because Malcolm X was a Muslim, if he was proponent for the Muslim movement in America, then I think the youth would have mostly likely been able to align with him more than the older generation, because just like it's in the DNA of the youth, I guess.
I feel like the older generation also has this idea that Martin Luther King was successful, while this newer generation kind of has this mindset that Martin Luther kind of failed in getting rid of underlying racism in America, and then maybe Malcolm X's approach, if we had adopted and embraced that, things could have changed up differently.
Okay.
It's like the idea sort of that Martin was kind of treating the symptoms of racism, whereas Malcolm was kind of trying to go deep down, burrow in and find the roots of it and expose them for what they really were.
And by the way, just a factual, the youth, SNCC, college students, they were with the Martin crowd, sort of, though they were not taking orders from Martin, right? But afterwards, yesterday's documentary, right? When things weren't going right, and Stokely Carmichael, so they kicked out John Lewis, who was the president of the SNCC, and brought in Carmichael, who had bought into the black nationalist ideology. So that's where the split. Earlier on, you mentioned Du Bois. You could say King is from the Du Bois tradition. Malcolm, not from Booker T, but from Marcus Garvey. In fact, his father was a Garveyite who was killed. So, well, the bell rings, and thank you. I will be away for the rest of the week, so I trust you guys will not give Miss camaraderie. Okay, be good to her. Okay.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. All right. Thank you. Okay.
We'll be well behaved.
Yes. Always.